Hi everyone, it's Charlie Kyle, the principal of Innis College, and I'm happy to welcome you to tonight's event celebrating that world-renowned iconoclast, Peter Russell. Before we proceed, I will read the land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work and celebrate on this land. So as I've already mentioned, tonight's event focuses on the work and the, I guess you could say, the life of someone very near and dear to Innis College, Peter Russell. And to give a fuller introduction to Peter and to moderate this event, we have another person who is near and dear to the college, and that is Rob Vipond. And I'm sure many of you know of Rob Vipond and his work, but for those of you who may not or need a little refresher, let me just give you a bit of that. So Rob Vipond is professor of political science at the University of Toronto. Born and raised on the prairies, he migrated east to attend the University of Toronto and graduated from Innis in 1975. He went south to pursue a doctorate, then came back to the University of Toronto, where he has taught American and Canadian politics for the past 40 years. As a scholar, Rob has been principally interested in the various ways in which history shapes and illuminates the political present, what political scientists call political development. This is the theme he developed in his first book called Liberty and Community, Canadian Federalism and the Failure of the Constitution, published in 1990. And in his most recent monograph, entitled Making a Global City, How One Toronto School Embraced Diversity, from 2017. And one might say everything in between. In addition to teaching and writing, Rob Vipond has had an active career in service to the university, and this is where Rob and I first crossed paths, I should say, in the many roles he's played within university administration. Among them, he has served as the chair of the Department of Political Science for a total of 10 years, over 3 tours of duty. And I have to chuckle as I read tour of duty, because that's sometimes how we feel about administration. He was also founding director of the Center for the Study of the United States. And, sorry, as I turn my pages ever so clumsily, which is at the Munk School of Global Affairs. He's also chaired the editorial board of the University of Toronto Press. In 2018, Rob was awarded the Vivet Goel Faculty Citizenship Award in recognition of his academic leadership at the university. And I can think of no one better suited to stick handle this conversation with Peter Russell than the illustrious Rob Vipond. So with that, I turn it over to Rob. Oh, hello, Rob.
Hello, hello. Thank you very, very much, Charlie, for that kind and generous introduction. When Charlie asked me to serve as the moderator of this evening's event, I began to reflect on just how many points of intersection I've had with Peter Russell over my years at U of T. Coincidentally, I settled into my dorm room at the old Innis residence, Vladimir House, at the same moment, more or less, the fall of 1971, that Peter was settling into what used to be John A. Macdonald's bedroom, now transformed into the Innis Principal's office at 63 St. George Street. In my third or fourth year, I took a remarkable and for me, life-changing course on American and Canadian constitutional law that Peter co-taught with Walter Burns. Peter persuaded me to canvass door to door to help elect his then neighbor Colin Vaughan to city council. I was a complete failure as a canvasser, but Colin was a success and went on to an illustrious career in that and then in media. Peter was on the search committee that appointed me to the position of lecturer in the Department of Political Science and took pity on me a number of years later and gave me tenure. You may think that's false modesty, but I assure you it isn't. A bunch of years after that, I became his chair in political science, and I was serving in that capacity when Peter took his retirement, in massive pulsating air quotes, thinking that if that's what retirement is, I'll take it. And most recently, in his capacity as the founding principal of Senior College, Peter asked me to serve on the college's board of advisors, which brought things back full circle. Peter Russell was once again my principal. I relate all of this simply to establish the fact that I've had a bird's eye view on the career of this remarkable man, this unlikely iconoclast, as we've called him. Why unlikely iconoclast? Well, he's the Trinity College man who became principal of the upstart college we know and love and call Innis. He's one of Canada's preeminent, if not the preeminent political scientist, but doesn't own a PhD. He's a former president of the Canadian Political Science Association who is deeply and openly skeptical about the scientific pretensions of my discipline. He's made a career of studying constitutional law, but isn't a big fan of letting courts have the final say in deciding what the charter means. He's a stout defender of the monarchy, but is wary of the unchecked powers of the crown. And while he has excellent colonial settler credentials and is a member of the Order of Canada, he was the first professor, this in the 1970s, that I had ever heard describe Canada's policy towards Indigenous people as totalitarian and genocidal. Always provocative, always thinking big, always calling them as he sees them. That's Peter Russell. And those same qualities absolutely run through his new book, Sovereignty, the Biography of a Claim, published this year by the University of Toronto Press. And that's where I'd like to begin the conversation. It's a short book. Here it is, and you'll see it as well, I think, on the screen. A shortish book is certainly in comparison to the magisterial Canada's Odyssey that he published in 2017. It's a short book, but it's on a big idea of sovereignty. I've prepared a few questions for Peter, but you should feel free to ask your own in the chat. They will be relayed to me, and I will get to as many of them as I can. Okay, Peter, welcome. Going to have Peter. There he is.
Thank you, Rob. I feel very honored to have this night about me, and I want to thank all those who conceived of the idea and have pulled it off. So thanks very much. Innisites.
So now we're going to make you sing for your supper. As we
Okay.
want to know a little bit about Sovereignty, the Biography of a Claim. I should say that I have a little bit of insider knowledge here because I was both at the time the chair of the Manuscript Review Committee at the U of T Press that saw it through, and I participated in a pre-publication manuscript workshop a couple of years ago. And I know that originally the subtitle, at least, wasn't quite, this is a little antiseptic, the Biography of a Claim. The original subtitle, if I remember, was The Idea of a Pernicious Claim. So that gives you a sense as to where this book is going. And you begin the book, I'll assume that many have not yet read it. You begin the book with an arresting story about an encounter that you had with Dene leaders in 1974 that got you thinking about this issue of sovereignty. I was wondering if you could recount that experience and then briefly explain how we get from Hobbes and Baudin in the 17th century and classic definitions of sovereignty to what you call the totalitarian regime of the Indian Act in Canada.
All right. It was June 1974, late June. I got a call from Yellowknife, from James Washee, a Grand Chief of the Dene people, D-E-N-E. Dene means us in Athabascan languages, all the way down the spine of the Western Rockies, just like Inuit means us. And I didn't know anything about Inuit, these indigenous people. I'd been teaching for 15 years, and the word indigenous, Aboriginal, Métis, Inuit, Iroquois, India, and they never passed my lips, nor were they in any of the books, the textbooks I used to teach about Canadian government. So I was a real neophyte. And he said, "We hear you're a constitutional expert." And to that I pleaded guilty. And he said, we've got a new approach, we Dene, up in the Northwest Territories, a new approach to Canada. We'd like to try it out on you. And I said, "Well, what is it?" Thinking we'd have a phone conversation. "Oh, no," he said, "you've got to come up here." I said, "When?" He said, "Right now." I was at my summer cottage in Georgian Bay. 24 hours later, though, I was in Yellowknife. And I walked into the Yellowknife Inn, to a small conference room, and there were 6 Dene people. I thought they were elders, but I learned later what elders were. They're not just old people. And these weren't all elders. And there were 6 of them around the table, and only one of them was a woman. But it was the woman who asked me, "Rob, 2 questions." And as she said that, I said to myself, "I've come all the way here just to answer 2 questions." I didn't say that out loud. She said, "Yes, the first is sovereignty. What is it?" And I thought to myself, stupidly, "Well, I know all about that. That's what I teach at U of T, Hobbes and Baudin and all that stuff. What's your second question? How did the Queen get it over us?" "Holy smoke," I said. "I never thought of that question." "You have?" I said, "It's a big question." And they nodded. They said, "It is a big question. What's the answer?" I said, "I'll be damned if I know. I've never thought about it, but it's huge. It's important, not just for you, but for all the Indigenous people in Canada, really in the Americans, in the world, and everywhere." How did it happen? Well, I said, "I'll tell you what, I don't know the answer, but I'm going to try and find it out. But it's summertime, and I'm going to go down to my colleagues in the law school. They know all about this sort of thing. They teach international law, and I'll ask them as soon as the law school opens." So I did, and walked down Philosopher's Walk from our political economy offices on Bloor Street, and I knocked on 6 doors of 6 learned colleagues, and to each I told them the story I've just told you tonight about the second question. "Oh," they said, "that's a very big question, Peter, big question. How did the Queen get sovereignty over them?" I said, "I know that. Well, what's the answer?" "Well," they said, "we don't know, but we're sure we have sovereignty over them." I said, You are, huh?" "Oh, yeah. But we don't know how we got, you don't know how we got it." "No." I said, "Well, I'm going to try and find out." And Rob, that's what set me on my inquiry into sovereignty. And I've been speaking a little too long, maybe, but it took me roughly 7 years and a lot of travel, particularly in Australia and in Canada, to find out this much: that sovereignty is not a thing. It's not an it. It's not like a big cloud that somebody up there has created, a big law that comes down on you. like a big dark black cloud. Oh no, it's a speech act. It's something that people claim over other people. It's a claim. And that a claim involves at least two peoples. And I got fascinated with when that claim began. And I really was interested, and it's so important for those listening tonight know, I'm interested in the claim of sovereignty. I know I wasn't puzzled about tyrants and dictators and horrible people. There's Homo sapiens has had them for thousands and thousands of years. I was actually interested in how that Levin word was used, and its noun that comes out of it, sovereign, how they started. And I found out that they started in Frankish Europe in the early Middle Ages. So sovereignty had both a Latin and Frankish derivation. And I found that at first it meant anything up high. But then it started to be used for the first time by men who are landowners in the early Middle Ages to say they had sovereignty over all their land and all their family, including all the women and children. And what did that mean? Well, they were up there. They were supreme authority. They were the supreme authority. They had absolute authority over their land and everybody on it. And then a few years later, it started to be used in politics. When Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Emperor in 800 came along, and he said, well, I'm the vicar of God, who's the sovereign of all creation. So the first real political sovereign was up there, was God, the big guy. And Charlemagne claimed to be God's vicar on earth. And the only problem with that was he had a rival, the Pope, who put the crown on his head. The Pope said, I'm God's vicar on earth. And 6 centuries of warfare ensued. Both the Pope and the Emperor, Holy Roman Empire, believing God is sovereign, but I have a direct pipeline to him. I'm his vicar, and he has absolute control over all creation. And I'm his vicar on earth. And as I described that happening in my early chapter of my book, I say that shows you the beginning of the danger of the sovereign claim. It's too big. It's too damn big. It's too damn absolute for human beings. So that's all the whole book begins. And then you're asking me about, we get to Hobbes and Baudin. And when sovereignty comes down at the beginning of the Reformation, well, not the beginning, after the Reformation, and they're fighting Protestants and Catholics, and the Renaissance is beginning, sovereignty comes down from God, and Hobbes and Baudin says it belongs to the state. The state is sovereign, has sovereign authority, right? And over everybody in it and everybody who comes in it, anybody who crosses its borders. Well, the thing about saying the state is sovereign is the state is a 5-letter word. The state doesn't walk around and do anything. Or état, a 4-letter word in French. People do things, not words. And the sovereign, the authority, governing authority that claimed sovereignty was the sovereign monarchical ruler typically, of the sovereign state. So the sovereign of the sovereign state around the 16th century becomes the absolute authority of everything that happens to the people and the land that over which he claims, or there were some queens coming along, or she claims sovereign authority. Okay, so we're up to the 1700s, and you want to know how we get from that, the sovereign state, to the you want to skip all the way up to the totalitarian regime of the Indian Act. Is that right, Rob?
Yeah. So, well, let me put it this way. You have a whole chapter in the book called "The People Become Sovereign," and
yeah, that's the next step.
The French Revolution is clearly a really important turning point.
That's right.
A wonderful quote from a scholar who talks. This says, "Popular sovereignty has become the wallpaper of modern life," and I just love it. And it's really in the background; you don't really notice, but somehow everybody accepts that. And,
yeah.
And Canadians too, right? I mean, I remember when Jean Drapeau was winning election after election as mayor of Montreal. There was one time when after an election, he got up and his whole victory speech consisted of one statement: "The will of the people is the will of God," which he did in French, English, and Latin, right?
Right.
So I mean, Canadians are very familiar with this, and one of your other wonderful books in the 1990s, entitled "A Constitutional Odyssey: Can Canadians Become a Sovereign People?" was written very much in the moment when that sort of language was coming up, right? Trudeau the Elder was talking about the people's package as opposed to the government's package, and how he wouldn't trade fish for rights. Clyde Wells was going on about the sovereignty of the people, and yet we ended up with the Meech Lake debacle and then the Charlottetown Accord. So what's interesting, as I remember your argument there, is you said, well, Canadians can be a sovereign people, but really only in negative terms. They can only say no, they can never say yes, right? So what I don't understand then is how this ragtag, can't get it together Canadian sovereign people could be responsible for all of the terrible things that are connected with sovereignty over Indigenous people. How do you explain the paradox?
I got you. Sure, she's like a paradox. Well, number one point is, remember, the people is a fictional thing. The last thing that leaders want, whether they're democratic or autocratic, is for the people who they say are sovereign to ever show up, ever turn up. God, no, we sure as hell don't want the people to turn up. And when you get peoples that number in the millions, as we do in so many states today, it's just about impossible for the people to show up. So the people's a fiction. And all rulers today, I know no exception, however autocratic or however democratic, claim they have a mandate from the people. The people are sovereign. The political party's not sovereign. No institution is sovereign. Even Parliament. It comes from the people. It comes from the people. But that's necessary to have support in our times. And it has been that way since really the 19th century and on into the 20th century. So people claiming their mandate comes from the people can be very democratic. Some of them are. And some might be like the rulers of China and Russia, to take signal to autocratic regimes. They're not democratic, they're autocratic, but they have a mandate for the people. Bullshit.
So how did settler sovereignty take this wrong turn to adopt, to imbibe the absolutism of that sovereignty argument?
Well, that was always its danger, Rob, claiming too much. And in the relations with indigenous people, it really showed up, because when we encountered them at first, I'm now talking about our own experience here in Canada and British North America before Canada. When the British first showed up, they very much respected, in effect, the independence and sovereignty of the indigenous people. They wanted them as allies. They wanted to use them as allies this is the British, to check the expansion of the United States westward. They wanted to have an indigenous buffer state, and they had no problem recognizing indigenous sovereignty. They didn't call them, don't say, hey, you Anasabec, you Haudenosaunee, you Mi'kmaq, you're sovereign. They just recognized them by entering treaties with them and treating them as independent people. But then we settlers came along, and we had what I call in my book is a chapter on settler colonialism. And unlike the British, we decided we had to get rid of the indigenous people, not in a bloody way, but making them disappear as different from ourselves by killing their culture, their language, taking the Indianness out of them. And we entered into a heinous, miserable period. And we justified our doing that because at that point, we were convinced that only civilized people could enjoy real sovereignty. We come to think civilized people who we define as A, white, and B, Christian. And if you weren't white or Christian, you didn't cut. You didn't cut it. You couldn't have sovereignty. So the only future, they thought the most benign future, much better than killing indigenous people, is to make them like us. And we got on this terrible path of forced assimilation, which we're now reminded, we got our flags at Mass, had half Mass, because we did absolutely dreadful things to the indigenous people to try to force the Indianness out of them, including killing thousands of their children. So we did that. That's how we got there.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, I mean, this is, to ask a question, a sort of counterfactual, really. If you could imagine that the idea of sovereignty hadn't taken hold to quite, that extent, if it hadn't become the wallpaper of modern life, do you think that would have altered the way in which, in this case, first the British authorities, but then more importantly, colonial settler governments thought about indigenous populations? In other words, was it just that they just didn't have which was more important, that they didn't have the creativity to think beyond sovereignty, or that that sense of racism of a hierarchy of superior to inferior was really what was driving it? Or was it the fusion of the two that made it so powerful, through the numbered treaties, right, especially from the 1870s on?
Well, it was our creation in Europe of the state. We talked about that in answer to your first question. When the state becomes sovereign and its rulers become sovereign, then for the first time, really, in what all we know of Homo sapiens' history, there became units of political organization bigger than villages, family villages, and smaller than empires. Empires and small villages had been the main form in which human beings had formed political entities. The state was a convenient intermediate size. And the state, to be effective, had to claim sovereignty not only over its own territory and people, but it had to have that sovereignty recognized by other states. So, and that seemed crucial, but it might have been possible to have states all around the world recognized had it not been for the prejudice of Christianity and white racism. But when you classify peoples who are white and not Christian as uncivilized, sovereign states will be only for civilized people. And neither the Chinese nor the Africans nor our indigenous people made it.
So turn a little bit more, somewhat more positive, on a more positive note. One of your chapters is called Federalism Takes the Sting Out of Sovereignty. Do you explain what you mean by that? And do you think that there were many, that there's how would that solution work? Put it that way.
Okay. Glad you asked about federalism, and I hope our listening and watching our audience on Zoom don't go to sleep or turn on the Leaf Tampa Bay hockey game at this point, because federalism is almost guaranteed. It's a sleeper, but it's the key to enjoying self-rule and shared rule, and having several sovereignties within a single sovereign state. I'll say that again. Several sovereignties within a sovereign state. That's a hard idea to understand, but if you start with our provinces and our federal government, right? They are independent of one another in that the provinces can't just grab power away from Ottawa and take away Ottawa's powers, nor can Ottawa do the reverse to the provinces. The provinces and the federal government have independent powers within a sovereign Canada. And that's the key to our accommodation of Indigenous peoples' sovereignty. And they will be and are in the 31 agreements they've made since we agreed in principle to recognize their sovereignty, prodded by our own Supreme Court to do so. We've made 31 agreements with peoples whose we regard as sovereign people, sovereign nations. The Inuit like to be called people. That's why I blur nation and people together. They're never organized as a nation. So we have 31 agreements. And the powers of the Indigenous government that are agreed to in each of those agreements cannot be just removed by either a province or a territory or the federal government. So they have that kind of independence. Now, the absolutism, claiming the whole thing like God and like the sovereign state, the sting's gone out of that. Once you incorporate a federal structure into your sovereign state. Canada is a sovereign state, one of the 193 at the United Nations. So we haven't broken the country up, and yet we've been able to recognize sovereignty of the key parts of our country within, including the provinces and Indigenous peoples with whom we are making agreements. Does that help at all, Rob? That's federalism. Thank you, federalism. You can turn the Leaf game off now.
This reminds me of the discussions in the early 90s, when we were talking about a third level of government. Is that more or less what you see on the horizon, or that has actually been working under the horizon, as it were, outside of the constitutional process, but yielding a sustainable constitutional/political future?
I think the word level is a little loaded. It sounds like there's 1, 2, 3, and they're in a hierarchy, but they're not. They're not. Ottawa is not superior to the provinces, and the provinces in Ottawa aren't superior to sovereign Indigenous nations. They form a country together, and they respect one another's sovereignty. I wish I had handy a slogan type way of describing it, but I worry about 3 levels being interpreted in a hierarchical manner.
Okay, so I have one more question that has to do with Canada, then I want to move on, because the book is more than just about Canada and its relationship to Indigenous people. But so at one point you have a really, really nice discussion. I'm drawn to the discussion of the French Revolution and to Locke and all of the stuff that was going on in the late 17th and 18th century. And you make the point when you say, in the appeal to popular sovereignty, nation and people were interchangeable, right? So this idea of popular sovereignty, it was, as you pointed out with relation to sovereignty, an abstraction. So the idea of a nation gave that some real concrete substance, right? It was no longer just some sort of pre-political contra. It was the French and the German nation, right? And the British nation and the Welsh nation and all of those. And the other thing that goes with it, it's certainly an important theme throughout the book, but you don't raise it in that context explicitly, is land. That people went together with nation, went together with territory, right? A claim of the Welsh, it's not just the Welsh nation, it's the Welsh nation that actually has territory set aside, right? So I'm wondering if, in talking about the importance of, in talking about, First Nations, in talking about the sovereignty of Indigenous people, here's to play the devil's advocate. Is it possible that we'll just be reinventing the problem in a different way? That you'll be saying to nation, the Indigenous nations have rooted in sovereignty, and that means the sovereignty of that foundational constituent sovereignty that provides for exclusive, I don't want to use the word jurisdiction, that sounds too federal, but the exclusive claims to a certain territory, when in fact the whole idea of federalism is, there's another version of the land acknowledgement that we have at U of T, which has this language of caring and sharing, right? That in allowing for that language of Indigenous sovereignty, we get back to precisely the problem of exclusivity, put it that way, rather than caring and sharing, which is the idea of federalism. I haven't really articulated that so clearly, but you see what I mean?
Yes, if I follow you correctly, I think the key problem is treating a nation as a unified ethnic and political entity. And none of them are, including indigenous nations. They have divisions within. And once they're treated as a unified whole, we start getting away from their own reality, whether it's Canadian, take the French nation or the German nation. They've got much ethnic diversity. There is not a nation state in the world that's ethnically unitary, including, of course, the United States and every state you can think of. So nations are pluralistic entities, and they often have internal politics. And sometimes, and right now is such a time for many Indigenous peoples in Canada, getting their act together is not always easy. We shouldn't be surprised that they have internal divisions, just as we do, and every nation does. And that's why we're going very slowly down the path of making treaties with Indigenous peoples and nations. They have to have their act together for us to do that, for them to take over responsibility for their people and their land in a coherent and effective way.
Is that what you mean by treaty federalism?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's the path we're on now. It's tough, it's challenging, but we're making our way.
Good. Now, part of the scope, if you like, of the new book is that you move beyond the question of Canada to larger global issues. So how does sovereignty play with or play on impact our ability to deal with these three really dire global problems that you identify: climate change, nuclear disarmament, and global migration? And I guess the big question then is sovereignty the problem or the solution, or both or neither?
I think it's the problem, as we watched COP26 at Glasgow, and all the states making their resolutions, and then all the observers pointing out, well, most of it is just words, nothing much will happen. So with those three existential problems of climate change, human migration, weapons of mass destruction, and I've added in an epilogue, as you know, to the book, pandemics, such as the one we're still struggling with, COVID-19. It's really just as clear as it can be that until we have, and this, I'm going to sound like an old record or something, until we have a world federation with real power, that and a world federation means that the sovereign states are units of the world federation. But it also is a federation in which there's a global government. It has to be elected, has to be democratic. I got some ideas about that. And it has to have some real power to tax and have armed forces. Without those two crucial powers, and it needs a very small list of powers. It doesn't have to do the everyday work that governments do as social services, such as education and health and all that, but it needs a very short list of world problems that 193 independent sovereign states cannot solve without a global authority. It's not going to happen in my lifetime. I don't need to be told that. But I look at Greta Thunberg, I talk to my grandkids, and not my children, my grandchildren in their 20s and 30s, and they're getting it. And they're going to do it. We can't do it because we've bought into the way of the world's organized so much we can't conceive a world with a China and the US and Russia ever conceding power to a world authority. I hope it doesn't take a dreadful climate crisis or a dreadful loss of security for people driven from their homes by environmental change and political oppression. I hope it doesn't take a complete failure to get vaccines to the people who need it most. But it may be that it'll take a tragedy and 2 or 3 generations younger than me to pull it off. But I deeply believe that they'll do it, or we won't have this planet. We'll lose the planet.
So the question I was going to ask you, the ones that to complete the ones that I have, was in a way, I think you've answered it. I said, are you an optimist or a pessimist?
I can't afford pessimism.
Yeah.
That's just a sort of self-flattering, know-it-all kind of cynicism in my mind. You've got to hope, and you've got to work, and you've got to pray for things to get better. I can't be anything but an optimist.
That's a great sentiment on which to end this part, at least. Now, a number of people have sent in some questions, and I hope that those of you who are out there will put some more in the chat. But here's one that refers quite nicely, I think, to the sort of the themes that we were talking about. So one member of the audience has asked, there were many opinions shared regarding the constitutional appropriateness of the appointment of Mary Simon as Governor General of Canada in July. What's your scholarly opinion on this matter?
Well, I think she's going to be a terrific GG. I don't have any doubts about her capacity. I think it just came at the right time to have a great diplomat of the Northern Hemisphere, of the Arctic, as our GG. There's a limit to what she can initiate, but she can certainly be a wonderful helper to government in making our country one that we're proud of in its treatment of people in the North and Indigenous people generally. We've got a long way to go, but with her as our representing our sovereign, Queen Elizabeth, I think we're going to be very, very well served.
Right. Now, you have the reputation, well deserved, of having of knowing more about Parliament than 99.9% of the both the public and the academic world, I have to say. So here's a question on Parliament. Recently, Parliaments, federal and provincial, have prorogued several times. Does this benefit constituents, those of us in the public? It seems they spend less time in the House than ever before. What do you think?
Well, I think the latter is fairly true. It depends on your time span. What time span do you think they're talking about? Well, the number of sitting days for federal, provincial, and territorial parliaments has gone down a little bit. But I don't think prorogation is the main reason. I think there may be one or two people in the audience who don't know what prorogation means. Is it all right if I explain what it means?
Go ahead.
Okay. When you prorogue Parliament, you don't dissolve it. It's still the Parliament that was elected some years ago or months ago. But you can reopen it with a new speech for the throne and start a new agenda. It gives you a break from the agenda that you began with when your government was first sworn in and won the confidence of the House of Commons, and with a speech from the throne that was not defeated. And you feel you've carried out quite a bit of that, maybe most of it, and it's time you want to start on a new agenda. That's indeed the reason given by Justin Trudeau's party for that recent prorogation. Of course, when that happens, we always suspect rats. Politicians are doing something that rats do, nasty, right? We don't trust them, and that's a very good instinct. I may be sounding sarcastic about it, and maybe they're not always honest, and they want some just time off for some other reason. But in any event, that's what prorogation is. We've had quite a few, but I don't see it as the main reason for fewer days sitting in Parliament. I think you'd have to look very much at the committee work, both of the Senate and House of Commons and in the provinces and territories. Their legislative committees are often extremely active, even when Parliament's not sitting. And that's where a lot of stuff gets done.
So you don't worry so much about the what seems, the sort of the Donald Savoy argument of the delegation, much greater delegation to executive authority within the government, be it to cabinet ministers or, for that matter, to members of the public service. In a way, that the delegation in a way that makes that effectively. I mean, governments govern, but with less and less accountability to Parliament or to provincial legislatures.
Well, Donald Savoy, Savoie, for those who don't study political science, a maritime New Brunswick political science of outstanding caliber. I very much agree with his critique of the extent to which we have given power to unelected people in the Prime Minister's office, chosen by the Prime Minister to be his advisors, who all too often have more power than cabinet ministers themselves, who are elected and accountable to the public. We don't know the members of the PMO. We usually at least know the head of the PMO, the Prime Minister or Premier's chief political secretary or advisor, but they're very unaccountable. And it's very dangerous kind of centralization, and it's certainly been eroding the health of our parliamentary democracy.
Right. So following up from that, John Dirks, hello, John, asks whether you think we're developing into a quasi-presidential system where elections and power are all about the leaders, as in the US, the PMO seems more pertinent than the Parliament. How can we have better democracy in Canada with Parliament that would be more authoritative and respected?
Well, is it John who asked that question?
Yes.
Oh, it's a very good question, and he makes a very good point. I'm very worried about that drift towards presidentialism. I'm amazed at how many people I know, and I only really know university graduate type people, and who want one person in charge, one big person in charge, for whom debate and discussion preceding decision making disturbs them. They don't like deliberative democracy. Deliberative democracy is when the big issues of the day are deliberated on in public, and parliamentary institutions facilitate, when they're operating well, deliberative democracy. But presidential democracy is a very different beast. It's one person in charge who can do what he or she wants without deliberating in public about the pros and cons, how the policy can be made better, what its weaknesses are. So I like John's question, and I share his worry.
Yeah, I might add on the American case, because it loops back to that question of sovereignty. I mean, one aspect of sovereignty is what every political scientist has to repeat at one point or another, is Max Weber's definition of the state, which is that entity which has the legitimate monopoly on the use of force, right? And the whole point of the American, the 1787 group, was to actually deny or undermine that logic of sovereignty by creating this complicated, unified but complicated process with a balance of power, with checks and balances, with separation of powers, and so on and so forth. And the problem, however, is with the complexity of those 18th century institutions didn't quite fit 20th and 21st century problems. You get delegation to the executive branch, and both parties, both the Trumps and the Bidens of the world, need to fall back on that, and that leads to the sort of presidentialism, I think, that you're talking about. On the topic of the courts, another of your great areas of expertise, how do you think the Canadian judiciary, and this actually goes in a way ties into the question of confidence, really, and trust. How do you think the Canadian judiciary, thinking especially of its independence, is affected by the work of some former Supreme Court justices in the private sector, e.g. SNC Lavalin? Would it be different if they worked for Greenpeace or an Indigenous organization? In other words, is the afterlife of a judge irrelevant to how you think about the reputation of the courts and big ideas about justice in Canada?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. The first point, and the person who asked the question might be a little disturbed by this, but I have to say it. Nothing in politics, and certainly this applies to judges, can be totally independent of every other part of the political governmental system. Total independence is impossible. The only way you would ever get it is for the judges to kind of float down from a cloud above, self-appointed, I guess, because someone's got to appoint them, and someone has to preside over their behavior, but they would do that. I don't think anyone wants that. So our judges are a dependent part of government. They depend on governments to appoint them. They have more and more independent ways of monitoring their behavior. and investigating complaints about them, which I don't think we want them to be independent to investigate themselves. We want a balance. We want a balance of some independence, quite a bit of it, when it comes to deciding each case, but institutional independence, I don't think we want. As to the background, we want a mixture of backgrounds. We wouldn't want everybody who's appointed a judge to be a lawyer who's worked for Greenpeace. We'd have the whole Greenpeace team, or for all of them to have been involved with consulting with indigenous people. You want a range of experience on a court like the Supreme Court of Canada, a range of experience with people who know the private sector, know the business world, know the world of different ethnic groups, and certainly know something about Indigenous people. We're still looking, aren't we, for a place on the court for a great Indigenous leader, judge, lawyer, judge. So it's a mixture that we need on the court of backgrounds.
So Peter, let me invert the question from the audience. They're talking about what happens after Supreme Court justices, for instance, step down. But you were instrumental in opening up the process of vetting and considering candidates to become judges. Tell us a little bit about that and where it stands now.
Well, it stands pretty well. I think we have a pretty good process here in Canada that compares well with other liberal democracies. This has been a worldwide movement to have processes for selecting judges. First of all, making the courts open to candidates even to apply for, so they don't have to have been people active in politics who can catch the eye of political leaders to get their candidacy considered. And though going around the world of liberal democracies, Canada's done well in developing it. I was involved in helping South Africa in this regard, and most recently Nepal, as it adopted a new constitution and wanted a kind of selection process that had the values and principles operative in it that we have in Canada.
Good. Another question from the audience, Anne in the audience asks, does the UN have a role in your vision or hope for the future?
That's key question. Well, let me answer this way. When the United Nations was being founded, and its charter created at San Francisco at the end of World War II, there was a group of Americans who met, and they included a Supreme Court judge, 2 senators, a couple of leading businessmen, and Alfred Einstein. And they were very critical of the charter because they said it would leave power with the sovereign states that put the UN together. It would fragment power, and the world would not be able to survive the things that were going to happen to it. And they were thinking mostly about nuclear weapons at that point. They didn't have the migration problems that we now have, or they weren't aware of the climate problems that we are, or the human migration, but they certainly had control of the weapons of mass destruction. And we need a UN with independent powers, its own powers. And they were very critical, as am I. That's why I'm pushing in the end of my book for a federal organization of the world, which I've, earlier in our conversation, I've talked about. I'm glad to talk about it more. Maybe some of the skeptics may send a question and it's not going to happen. I explained, I know that it's not going to happen in your time, questioner, but I think it's got a chance in my grandkids' time, and certainly in my great grandchild Teddy's time. And I'm watching Greta Thunberg, the kind of person she is. I think her generation may do it.
Let me bring you back to treaty federalism. Kim in the audience asks, how can the differences between the system of hereditary chiefs in some First Nations and elected chiefs and band councils established under the Indian Act be reconciled in treaty federalism?
Oh, well, it's a good question, and a lot of Canadians are asking that question. I understand where it's coming from, but for the government of Canada and the government of British Columbia, because a treaty with an Indigenous nation has to be adopted by both the provincial and federal parliaments. What's important is that they're negotiating with the government of the Indigenous people. The band councils are not that. They were created under the Indian Act as a convenient way of distributing funds to Indian communities, grossly underfunding them, instead of letting the provinces or asking the provinces to supply their social health services in their schools. They were underfunded through band councils for decades and decades. They are not the Indigenous government. There's many people who are both serve on a band council and also have positions under the governance of the traditional leadership. And Canada can't make a treaty until they've got their act together sufficiently to offer a coherent signatory, if you like, partner with the province and with Ottawa to share governance and responsibilities. That's just crucial. And they know that. They want to do a good job if they take over responsibility, sovereign authority for what happens in their homeland. They want to do a good job, and they don't want to go into it and divide it. So we have to be patient. We sometimes have trouble getting our act together, and I've made this point before, and they will have and are having some difficulties, including in our own province.
So you think, would it be fair to summarize that by saying that you think the default position has to be that the only legitimate authority in First Nations will be the hereditary council, whatever hereditary form of rather?
Not all the people in the traditional government inherit their positions. Many of them are chosen for their skills and aptitudes in certain fields. It's hard to generalize about traditional Indigenous governments, but in many of them, people have different roles. For instance, sometimes women, mothers, are asked to choose who should have political leadership, who should be chiefs, because they've seen the kids grow up. They see who have the ability to command respect and be prudent and intelligent as leaders. And they see more of the kids growing up than the men do. So one of the traditions is having women choose the leaders. The women didn't inherit that, other than they inherit their gender.
Great. So let me ask you this final question, because I think that lots of people in the audience would be interested to know. It's a double-barreled question. The first is, where do you get your energy? And second, what's next?
Well, I finally asked that question because just before at tea time today, before I came down here to Innis, where I am now, I was reading the Literary Review of Canada, and there's a splendid article by Kingswell. You know him.
Yeah.
And he's talking about that. He's talking about whether he's looking at all the major novelists and whether their novels, their writing got better in their or worse as they aged. And his conclusion is you can't tell. Some people do their best writing when they're old. Some do, some don't write as well. In fact, he goes as far as to say he doesn't believe in generations. He just doesn't believe in generations. He believes in cycle. You belong to certain psychological groups. You might belong to the cynics of Canada or the optimists of Canada. But in terms of having energy to write and paint, and do poetry at an advanced age, it can happen to anyone. You may have it or you may not. I find it's what keeps me going. That's why I do it.
And do you have a project in mind?
Well, I've got a bunch of them. I want to just close with one. It's just very, because there was a question I saw about what we could do to advance democracy in Canada. And I'm working not as much as I should with the city charter movement. You may remember our dear premier interfering with the democratic process in Canada, cutting down the size of Toronto's council, right, and cutting off its election sort of in midstream. Well, people were, when the Supreme Court of Canada ruled on the first day of the last month, October, that he could do that, there was a hue and cry, let's amend the Constitution. Well, that's hard to do, but city charters are something we can do. You don't need all the provinces. We have an amending formula that would allow our province of Ontario, supported by the federal parliament, to pass legislation that would enable it to enter into charters with cities. And in such charters, the cities would be given their independence, their freedom over a few matters that are really important to them, like their size of their council when they have elections. There's one right now about housing, affordable housing possibilities that the cities are finding they can't enter into without provincial law, and they'd like a little more freedom in the housing area. So the city charter movement is something that I hope Innis College forms a chapter on, to be part of the city charter movement, because we've got to get this thing going by the June election, provincial election, and make city charters an irresistible thing for anyone wanting to do well in the election, including Premier Ford. And once we get the legislation, I think we can move ahead and give municipalities local democracy.
That's great, Peter. Thank you very, very much. It reminds me that I don't think I think I would be hard pressed to say that there's anyone in Canada who knows as much about or has made as many contributions to many different layers of Canadian political life as you. So thank you very much. And since you've thrown the gauntlet down to Innis College, let me turn it back over to Charlie Kyle.
I was afraid you were going to say that, Rob. Peter, what I will say is you provided a great segue to our next talk, which I will let people know about at the end of tonight's event. But before we get to that, I want to remind people that there are 4 books that will be given away. And before we do that, we have some closing remarks from speaker. Oftentimes we give this spot to a student speaker. Instead tonight it's to, still a student speaker, but a graduate student speaker. A graduate of Innis in 2020, so she is in fact one of our youngest alumni. And let me introduce her now, and I'll explain why we have chosen the person in question. Her name's Marielle Terabiznik. As I said, she's a 2020 Innis graduate. She's now pursuing her MSc in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, still here at U of T. Her work primarily on turtles takes her to Algonquin Provincial Park, but she has also studied lizards and arthropods, in Ecuador. And Marielle and I had a talk about her research on turtles, and she told me a whole bunch of stuff I didn't know about turtles, but then I had to realize I know very little about turtles anyway. But nonetheless, if we had a longer night before us, Marielle could, I'm sure, enthrall us all with the work she's doing. As interesting as all of that work is, and it is, we asked Marielle to provide closing comments today because she was the inaugural recipient of the Peter Russell Prize, which we proudly give out each year, to a student who produces innovative work related to some aspect of Canada. And Marielle's project, particularly apropos given some of what we've talked about tonight, which was originally conceived for a first-year foundation seminar on religion and violence, was a scrapbook that was designed to illustrate the policy that drove the residential school system at the same time that project depicted the lives torn apart by that system. Relying on primary documents and firsthand accounts, Marielle produced a shattering work that I still remember to this day. And so we were proud to recognize, as I said, this work with the Russell Prize, and so it seems particularly apropos to invite Marielle to speak at the end of an event that has been focused on Peter and his work. So I now ask Marielle to come to the camera and give us some closing comments, and then I will return after that.
Thanks, Charlie, for that lovely introduction, and thank you, Peter and Russell, for the great conversation, and everybody here for attending it. Now, as Charlie mentioned, political science is not my area of expertise. I study mainly turtles and reptiles, and as far as I'm aware, they've never formed any kind of government at all. But as a newcomer to these ideas, it's been absolutely fascinating to be part of and listen to this conversation on sovereignty and political science. I was especially moved by the importance, and that was highlighted, of reevaluating academic ideas and views that include Indigenous perspectives and issues, I think perfectly exemplified by the fact that the motivation for this project started off with that question of how did the Queen get sovereignty over us being the Dene Indigenous people in the story that Peter mentioned right at the beginning of this conversation. I'm sure it's a type of conversation and thoughts that's been happening throughout Canada with the recent indisputable evidence of all the deaths that occurred at residential schools to Indigenous children. And I'd like to thank Peter very much for his works and insights that he provided today in this talk, as well as for striking an optimistic tone, which is a rarity these days, given the general trajectory of the world and conversations I have with my peers in this generation. I'd also like to specifically thank him for his support of Innis students by creating the Russell Canada Prize that celebrates student academic and artistic excellence in their work. And with that, I'd like to pass it back to Charlie for the final closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Marielle. Peter, before I say my own thanks to you and Rob, I have to ask one last question that's in the chat. And it's, and I think we couldn't go without asking you about your carefully curated backdrop there. Can you tell us a little bit about the painting that is?
I'm going to move. Yes, Charlie. Let me move my head. In the background is a painting of Innis College in 1976. And if you look carefully, well, you'll see the little lane between the old house and the new building. And in the background, in the blue, you'll see Gretchen Rode tried to, she had graduated a year before my departure from the position of principal of Innis. She sort of carved my profile into the clouds. And there it is. And I've had it in my apartment and where I am now since 1976. I'm very, very fond of it. Charlie, you might, I don't know if you'd like to hand that to school for a while. It was a gift to me by the college at a farewell party when I was finished being principal in 76, was her painting.
Yeah, and when we talked about it a few days ago, I asked Peter if he would mind if I had my profile also inscribed within the clouds. And go ahead and say what you said, Peter.
Yeah, well, I think that'd be cool, but you have to find Gretchen to do that.
Oh, that's not what you said at all. You said not on your life. That's what you said.
Oh, did I say that? Well, Gretchen would do it.
Oh, yes, it's because of the artist that you had an objection. Anyway, the first thing I want to say is that I always, like Mariel, I always learn a lot when I am party to any conversation with Peter. You know, amazed not just by his energy as one of the question askers was, but also by his acuity of thought and the insight into our systems and our logics, if we want to call them that, of governance. And I can't think, and having now witnessed what transpired tonight, I can't think of a better interlocutor with Peter than Rob Vipond. So both happily associated with Innis College, and thank you both for this illuminating evening. And no doubt, Peter, in a few years, we'll be having another one as another book comes out. We'll have to commemorate that with another talk. So thanks to both of you. For those of you who are constant attendees to our talks and see the cycles pass, you may have noticed a bit of dark fuzz on my upper lip, and that's because it's Movember yet again, a month, November that is, that my spouse always dreads. But if you want to tune in to see how things progress north of my teeth, then there's a few more opportunities for you to see that. But more importantly, to hear these other two talks that we have scheduled for November. So on November 16th, and this is the segue from Peter's comments about cities and autonomy, we have the 2021 Harold Innis Lecture, which will be given this year by former Mayor David Miller. And the talk is called While Nations Talk, Cities Act. And David, having just returned at the time when the talk is being given from COP26, will also give us his insights into that. And then just merely a week or so later, we have Jesse Wente returning after his stint being last year's Harold Innis Lecturer to give a talk tied to his recent book, Unreconciled. And this again has both of these talks have a complementarity with what Peter and Rob have been talking about tonight. So I welcome you all back for those. And thank you all for attending. Thanks to our speakers. Thanks to, of course, the events team, as always. And I wish you all a good night and hope to see you again soon. Good night, everyone, and thank you.